You're listening to the Wrigleyville Nation podcast. Here's your hosts, Jeremy and Pat.
Hello and welcome to the Wrigleyville Nation podcast. This is episode 367 of the podcast. My name is Jeremy Deemer and I'll be your host. And I'm joined as always by my co-host. He's my cousin and he's high atop Wrigleyville tonight. How's it going, Pat?
It's going well, Jeremy.
We're back from a off season. We take a month between shows, unless there's an emergency pod situation where we have to have something to talk about, but not a ton of news. We had breaking news today. We will cover the Presley to the Cubs trade in the second half of this episode. We're going to talk about all of the offseason moves, Cubs convention, what else we see the Cubs doing later, as Jared Wyllys will join us on the second half of this program. We will be opening up the first half of this program, doing our annual chat with Dan Szymborski, talking about the Cubs Zips projections for 2025. Dan, thanks for taking time out to talk Cubs and Zips with us tonight.
Hey guys, how's it going today?
It's going well.
Always great to catch up with you. And before we get into the breakdown of the work you did over at Fangraphs, can you give a quick 30-second elevator pitch for those who aren't familiar with Zips and the projection system that you're the proprietor of here? Can you give a quick overview for the listeners who might not be super familiar with it?
Well, Zips is a projection system I've been working on for 20 years. You've seen it at Fangraphs at ESPN. Basically, it takes a player's history, StatCast data, and the like, establishes a baseline for a player, compares that player to every other player in history that player can be compared to, and then tries to kind of get a guesstimate of where the player is going in the future, estimate the highs and lows, the upside, downside, and hopefully it's not too terrible in the end. That's always the goal of a projection system. Be the least awful way of predicting the future.
Can we talk about that for a second? I have a little quibble with Zips the last 4 years. You've come on the last 4 years, and every time you've come on, you've presented the Cubs Zips results. And every year, your machine basically takes all the Cubs players and it unceremoniously maligns them and discards them into the trash. And identifies them all as being fairly bad or average to bad at baseball. And then those poor guys show up at spring training. They look at their Zips forecasts. They realize that basically, they have nothing to play for all year. And then they proceed to have terrible years because their confidence has been destroyed by your forecasts. So imagine my surprise this year, Dan, when I opened up Zips expecting more of the same. And all of a sudden it was zippity-doo-dah, zippity-yay, my oh my, what a wonderful day, because the machine is actually, I don't know whether you put your thumb on it or if you got paid off, but somehow the Cubs have actually come out of the winter looking far better than they did going into the last several seasons in your projections.
Well, after being mean for so many years, players will build up a tolerance to this. So sometimes you have to unfairly build up their confidence so that the fall is even crueler. That's mostly a Mets thing. The happier the outcome, the more hilarious the disaster will be. If you want to see bleak, some of the Rockies projections in the last I think for the White Sox, I think their manager is probably the fifth best outfielder. So it's better to have it's better to be a Cubs fan right now.
Well, last year's manager was their third best outfielder, Grady Sizemore, right? But
he might have been.
Dan, did anything jump out as a surprise to you? Were there any players here that there's always some that you've gotten familiar with over the years where you're like, oh, Zips really likes this guy, and that's holding true here, or oh, I didn't realize Zips liked this guy or was holding something against this guy?
Oh, well, I think if you're talking about one specific projection, Pete Crow Armstrong's projection probably stands out as the flashiest. Zips projected, the center field position combination on our depth charts at the time of Crow Armstrong and Alexander Canario. And it had him as a 4-win season, and that's pretty good. That's mostly PCA there. That's not Canario doing that heavy lifting there. I think maybe, but more than any one single projection, is just how much Zips likes the offense from top to bottom. It basically has every position in really, all of them as above average overall, which is an unusually sunny disposition for Zips.
So of the 9 offensive positions, counting DH, catcher is the weakest for the Cubs, and even that is 2.5, right, which is higher than the 1.4 of last year when the Cubs had Amaya along with Yan Gomes. I was struck, though, in addition to just how everybody seems to have maintained or elevated their baseline from last year, Ian Happ turned 30 years old, and he went from a 2.6 to a 3.7. So that's a significant jump. Is he just hitting his stride in his 30s? Is that what you're telling us?
I don't know about just hitting his stride, but Zips just sees less downside from him. He hasn't.
Is he Paul Molitor? Is he going to be a 3,000 hit guy? Through because of his 30s and early 40s?
Probably not, because has he? I don't think he's even hit 1,000 yet. He'd have to probably play till he's like 60. But you look at Happ's data, his hard hit data, it was improved from 2023. His barrel percentage, he was hitting the ball with more authority, more balls in the air, fewer on the ground. You look, his contact rate, which had dipped in 2021, has kind of stabilized in the mid 70s. So Zips isn't as worried there. His out of swing percentages have gone down. He's not likely to, become like a superstar or anything offensively, but there are indicators that he's going to be pretty sticky in the 120s for, OPS plus, WRC plus for the next few years at least, forestall that decline a little. It'll come eventually, but Zips does not think that this is the year that's going to happen.
And similarly, Seiya Suzuki, who had a fairly pessimistic score last year, 2.4, when, we thought he'd be one of our better hitters, if not the best hitter in the lineup next to Bellinger maybe. I see, having moved to designated hitter, his number's actually up to 3.5, which is kind of rare because he doesn't get credit for any defense, really, much defense for that. But apparently the system saw something last year in him that they liked and think that he's going to build on that, I guess.
One thing that does help him by a few decimal points is that Zips WAR penalizes DH the same as first base, which Fangraphs WAR does not. So he'll lose a couple runs when he gets on the site. But I have I'm pretty stubborn about that, and it's likely, nothing's in stone yet. It's likely we're eventually going to do that at Fangraphs. Because there's actually a lot of body of evidence. I've done some work on it. Mickey Lickman and Tom Tango have as well, that even when healthy hitters do worse when they play DH than when they play the field. There's just something about sitting on your butt for half the game that makes you not hit. And to an extent, you see that even more extreme version of that with pinch hitters. Healthy or not, everyone is relatively awful as a pinch hitter. Everyone loses like 180 points of OPS or something like that, pinch hitting from regular. So there's something about not playing the field that actually makes it a little harder to hit. So Zips gives him a couple percentage points there. A lot of it comes down to confidence because he was a player who didn't have obviously a long history in the United States, and translating from Japan is still an uncertainty. Now he has more of a body of evidence behind him. He had his best offensive year in 2024. He's not old yet. So I think that Zips is probably reasonable here. The other systems do not like him quite as much, but just take the happy one for a change.
No, I certainly do. And I think Jeremy would probably agree with me also that we were surprised that our middle infield combination of Horner and Swanson, both of whom had sort of down years last year compared to previous years, not only will they maintain what the projection was going into last year, but they're projected to exceed that. In fact, Swanson is projected to have a 4.9, which is, it's pretty good for a guy who struggled as much as he has the last couple of years.
But remember he was at 4.3 WAR in 2024.
Right.
4.9 in 2023. People tend to underrate what a good, I mean, not Cubs fans so much, but he's such a good defensive player that just being, a league average hitter, overall, who plays a Gold Glove with shortstop is pretty darn valuable.
What's your take on defensive WAR? Because I know some people have started to question or recoil a little bit from the value that some players get in defensive WAR. And I think a good example of that this year would be Kyle Tucker is projected at 4.5 and Swanson at 4.9. And I think most fans would say that they think Kyle Tucker is certainly the better player, the superior player, and the more valuable player.
Well, the thing is, if you look at the defensive numbers for most players don't get that much of a bump from their defensive numbers. Most players at a position tend to be between 5 better or 5 worse than league average. But when you have these guys who are 10, 15 or more runs relative to already a difficult position, because shortstops as a group are a really good defensive just population. There's a bad shortstop is still a pretty good defensive player.
There's a reason they play shortstop.
Picture. Yeah.
It's a tough job.
And to be that good relative to that has a lot of value. At the end of the day, a run is a run. And, we have players like offensively that are like 50, 60, more runs than that above average offensively. You'll never get a defensive value like that. But it can add real value here and there. And in Swanson, he's arguably the best shortstop in baseball. You can quibble or argue who is the best, but he's that rare player who is extremely valuable defensively above and beyond his offensive production.
So looking at this Cubs team, I had a question about how, we talked about Suzuki. I was wondering, when looking at other players that are coming over from Japan, how does Zips account for that history? Is that included here, or is it like weighted differently? How do you account for that?
Well, it's faded more to the background because he's been in the U.S. for 3 years. Zips in the database has every move of a player from Japan to the United States, or the United States and Japan, pictures and hitters. And so it does have an idea of how to translate it. Zips tends to see as a result that the level of play in NPB is somewhere between AAA and the majors. It's a little better than AAA, especially, at the top end, because players are artificially restricted from coming here. They have to, post or have to pass a certain number of years. You can't just come over here at 22. Then I think you might actually see, MLB get a little better and NPB get a little worse. But it's still risky because it's also, culture shock. It's the game is it's getting closer, but they do value some other things in Japan that they don't necessarily value the same way here. Contact hitting is more of a thing still over there, although it's becoming more MLB like in a way. But it's a big change to come over from Japan to the United States or to go over there. Same when you send American players over there. Some of them really thrive over there and sometimes they struggle. So there is going to be this element of uncertainty in translating a player. But Suzuki, after 3 years, what he did in Japan has kind of faded from significance when you're talking about projections. He's going to stand by what he does in the United States at this point. And he's been getting better. Every year his WRC plus has gone up. He's been healthier. Well, I wouldn't say every year, but better than the first year, let's just say. So there's a lot to like about him, and I wouldn't put any stock, I think, in Japanese statistics at this point. It's all MLB right now.
Well, Shota Imanaga had a pretty robust assessment from you going into his freshman year last year with the Cubs, 3.2. He sort of met that. I think he met that expectation roughly, and you've got him right around there again this year, 3.1. I think you had mentioned last year that he was, you thought, one of the best bargains in free agency because you had him projected far higher than his contract would otherwise indicate.
Yeah, I talked about him a lot on social media. I went out on the limb and I called him the best free agent signing of the offseason. And so I'm glad he didn't bomb like some other Japanese pitchers.
You nailed this one. You nailed this one.
But he went. It went very well, and obviously, since he kind of played how Zips expected, his projection doesn't come out that differently. since Zips already expected him to play like this. So I'm just beyond liking him. I'm also glad it worked out because, no one likes to look stupid.
Well, I think the rest of the projection systems around the country are starting to catch up to you. So it's nice to see them eventually matching you or adopting your position on this one. The rest of the starting pitchers are pretty much the same as last year. It feels like there's a lot of, with Steele and Tayon and Assad, and now we've got Boyd from Detroit 2.1. I mean, they all seem somewhat in the realm of likeliness. You never know with these guys with injuries and whatnot, but I think
Boyd's really interesting in a way. He came back from injury and he was legitimately excellent in not a lot of playing time, but he really came back and was good. So and he's an interesting pickup.
Do that for an extended period of time this year, ideally in September and October.
I mean, what kind of impressed me is he came back striking out 10 batters a game,
right?
Which is not really what you would think of him before. It isn't like he came back like Charlie Morton and threw 98, but his changeup looked sharper. I'd have to really go through it, but he looked just better. But of course, some of that is because he was striking out a lot more guys, so you're going to actually look a lot better. But I think he was a nice little gamble because it didn't really cost that much. I mean, 2 years, $29 million is a lot of money for me or you, I assume. But it's in big picture baseball, it's not that much.
Do you think we could get anywhere popularizing a new nickname for him? We'll call him Gas Can Boyd because of the strikeouts.
I'm sure that's not the first time he's heard something like that.
Can't do oil cans taken, right?
Yep,
so
that's right.
Something better. The one area, you came out with your initial Zips projections fairly early for the Cubs. Usually they're one of the later teams, but this year you just couldn't wait because they were so exciting. You wanted to give us a nice Christmas prize. So you gave them to us early. And at the time, the Cubs bullpen was sort of in a state of flux because they had not made all the moves that they were intending on making throughout the course of the offseason. Who knows if they still have or not. But as Jeremy alluded to in his opening, the addition of Ryan Presley is somewhat of an interesting development in that. So how do you see that fitting in, and how do you see the Cubs bullpen with his addition?
I think it deepens the bullpen. Zips, at least, and I agree with it, had the Cubs as an above average bullpen that could have probably used another arm or two at the end, but nothing like crazy good. Like it thinks the Twins are crazy good, the Guardians are crazy good, the Dodgers now. But the Cubs have a solid pen, and Presley is going to improve it. I don't think it necessarily changes the story of 2025. I think that it keeps away some of the downside at the back of the pen. A couple of guys get injured and stuff starts breaking apart. You can see the Blue Jays have had that happen where all their most of their rotation, their entire bullpen got injured. And
we did blow 26 saves last year, so it is sort of a point of contention for us.
True, but it's always hard. Blown saves are kind of a really tricky stat, but I think that they have a good pen. The Cubs don't really have a lot of really awful weaknesses. There's nothing I can really make fun of. I mean, I was just doing a Royals podcast a little while ago, and they had two corner outfielders around replacement level. They went to the playoffs, and they just kind of done nothing. So this is a sunnier hour.
Well, looking at we mentioned Presley coming over from Houston. Another Astro player that's on the minds of Cubs fans is Bregman. When we look at Shaw as the potential starting third baseman here, curious about the Zips values for a guy like Bregman.
There are teams that Bregman makes a lot of sense with. I don't really think that he would make that much sense as a Cub. The simple truth about Bregman is that if he had hit free agency a couple years ago, he'd be looking at huge money. Now, he did have a good season, but his offense has been in decline for a couple years. He had, rough going for a long stretch last year. I mean, he had a .315 on base percentage. He's entering his 30s. I know the 30s. I would like to be in the 30s again, but it's not great when you are.
It's going well for Ian, half at least.
His walk rate dropped in half from the year before, which isn't usually a good indicator. Especially because, I mean, he still makes good contact, but just he's not. He's just not the player he was like in 2018, 2019 when he was kind of at his peak, and that's going to really affect his value because he's in the same boat that I think Pete Alonso is in, that a big contract for him, a team is going to be paying for what he did, not what he's likely to do.
So if, and this is a big if your machine is not joking and is telling the truth about Matt Shaw being a 2.7 WAR guy at third, then I guess Bregman does seem a little bit redundant in the sense that he, at best you'd expect maybe 3.1, 3.2, somewhere in that range. So it's not much of an addition, assuming that Shaw has not moved to second base and Nico Horner traded. But given the current alignment with no other changes, it does seem that for the money that they would spend on him, they could probably do something better. I don't know what that might be at this point because they've lost out on a number of opportunities. But is that sort of what you're seeing?
Yeah, most of the good free agents are gone at this point. There are only really a few left. I guess the most interesting thing about a possible Bregman signing is then, as you alluded to, what they do afterwards. Like Bregman might not be a huge upgrade at this point in the next 5 years compared to Shaw, but the question is, does Shaw get you like Logan Gilbert or something, or a package including, or does Horner get you Logan Gilbert? And that really could improve the team. I think I'd rather have, just theoretically, pay for Bregman and have a Logan Gilbert or Luis Castillo over having Shaw and whatever starter that the acquisition would replace. I think there are things you can do, but I think just in and of itself, unless you have that really mapped out, and I don't know what the Cubs are because they don't tell me about their trade discussions, that Bregman's probably, they're just better places that I think would be willing to spend more on him. Like a team like the Mariners should be in on Bregman. The Angels, if they're going to continue to delude themselves that they're in contention, probably need Bregman. The Tigers could use Bregman. No, not the Rangers, but there are a lot of places he could go. I think that would be better.
And I feel like Detroit would be a terrible place because they had Dave Bergman and then Bregman. It's just too confusing, like historically.
Did Dave Bergman have a good mustache, or am I confusing it with Tom Brookins? I'm trying to remember.
I don't remember. I'm trying to.
I mean, it was the 80s and everyone had a good mustache.
I was going to say, well, one of our, I think, you mentioned Pete Alonso. What does Zip see as a good value for him? He's another name that was intriguing for the Cubs early on in the offseason here.
I think that teams are kind of evaluating Alonso similar to Zips, because Zips would offer Alonso 3 years, $70 million, which is not what he wants. But I think that's about probably what he's been offered so far. I think someone will cave and give him a little more, but he's kind of in that position where he seems to be in decline. And the fact that he hit a lot of home runs 3 years ago doesn't help his next team at all. It's interesting to see Scott Boris's problems with some of these second-tier free agents that teams aren't evaluating the same way they would have 15 years ago or 20 years ago. So I'm just fascinated by what happens with him in the end. I mean, he's still going to do pretty well, I think.
Well, one of our favorite things to do is go through your list of comps. Always a great time. Now, I was really impressed. First person I wanted to see was who Kyle Tucker's comps were. Mookie Betts, Gary Sheffield, Carl Yastrzemski. Not too shabby for
those are good comps.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are really good comps. I was pretty excited about that. Another comp that I kind of like is for Ian Happ. His second hit comp was Lee Mazzilli, former future Mickey Mantle for the Mets back in the late 70s and the 80s. So apparently he's the and Ben Zobrist was his third comp. That's pretty good company.
I think my favorite this year, Matt Shaw got Danny Tartable, and it's always the reminder that Danny Tartable was an infielder for a while.
And I see some that seem a little bit. Well, Dansby Swanson got Joe Cronin, who I assume is in the Hall of Fame, right? Must be.
Yes. Hold on. What are you looking?
No,
Are you?
that's not this year. This year it's
Was
Bill
that last
Rigney.
year?
Yeah, you're on last year.
I'm sorry. That was last year's comp. Okay.
Yeah, Dansby Swanson has Bill Rigney, Tommy Harper as his first
Yeah,
two.
so he's gone down because last year was Marcus Semien and
No.
Joe Cronin. I'm like, that's although his actual numbers have gone up as his comps have gone down, which is an interesting.
Well, remember they're offensive
paradox.
comps only, not defensive comps.
Sure,
so,
that's right.
So sometimes you'll have like a really good defensive player compared to a really bad defensive player. It's like,
right.
It's just they're bad.
So when you compare Nico Horner to Steve Sachs, we don't have to freak out because there's no defensive element to that. So we don't have to worry about the inability to throw to first base. Is that right?
Yeah, and hopefully he won't, commit murders and get detained for 20 years in Springfield.
And then, of course, Von Hayes was one of the Ian Happ comps, and he had the famous 5-for-1 trade with the Phillies.
Yeah, so if you could trade Ian Happ for 5 guys, old 5-for-1.
If they're any good. Gage Workman, who, we had some hope would be like a 24th, 25th man on the team. His comp was Avon de Jesus, which sadly for me, as a big Avon de Jesus fan growing up, when you look at his numbers and his stats, they don't quite align with my memory of how good he was. The advanced statistics have done him no help.
Gage Workman is interesting, though. He came out as one of the best defensive players in the minors last year in Zips. I have a coordinate-based system that estimates the probability of every ball hitting a play being fielded. Because I have some pretty good. It's not as good as Statcast's OAA, but you take what you have in the minors. And it had him as a really, really solid, one of the best defensive third basemen in the minors. So I'm interested to see when he was picked up if he makes the roster, because he does have some flexibility, defensive value. He could be a really good utility infielder guy for the Cubs.
Now I see there's one, I think, error here in your comps. For Seiya Suzuki, the error is his number one comp is Al Smith, who we all know ran for president in 1928 against Hoover. But I don't think Seiya Suzuki could run for president, right? Because
they had to change the.
So yeah. So you might want to think about that one. I do like Moises Ballesteros with the Miguel Montero comp. That's a nice one for us.
Yeah, familiar face there. Miguel Montero.
And of course, I don't know where these come from. You got to help me with this one. So Trace Thompson, who I don't expect to see much of this year, his comp is Rick Monday, who's one of my heroes. So explain that one to me.
That's actually a surprising one now that I think of it. I'd really had to dig into that one. That does seem a little
lofty,
a little aggressive for him.
I mean, Rick Monday, wasn't he the first number one pick in the first ever draft or something like that? Baseball draft? With the Dodgers?
Wasn't it like Rick Reichard or someone, or am I confusing something?
I thought it was Monday, but in any case,
okay,
Rick Monday was awfully good.
I couldn't say offhand why Zips. I'd have to dig into that. I don't think there were 2 Rick Mondays. That's what happens. No, it happens a lot with it happens a lot with Bob Gibson.
Yeah,
because there was an 80s reliever named Bob Gibson.
Yes, there
everyone's
like
was. Bob Gibson, like no, not that Bob Gibson.
No, not as good.
No, I don't think there was another Rick Monday yet. I don't know. That is an interesting pick. I don't know why. I can't open it that quickly en route.
Sure.
But I can message you guys on Twitter.
There you go. There you go.
I mean, that does seem aggressive.
So another one that I thought was a little bit interesting to see was Justin Steele, who's 29 years old now. His number one comp is Zane Smith, which felt like a little bit of a letdown. The former Brave and Pirate. But his number 3 comp was Tommy John, which isn't bad, unless it's the year Tommy John was out with having the surgery named after himself. I don't know exactly when that occurred. is Zane Smith, is Justin Steele better than Zane Smith?
Well, Zane Smith did have a pretty good run. Remember, Zips is looking backwards when it looks at the comps. The baseline expectation. It doesn't mean that he's going to be Zane Smith going forward. That's just one of many possibilities. The thing about the comps is that Zips is comparing each player to a huge cohort of similar players.
Sure.
Whoever's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it doesn't really make that much of a difference. It's just fun. And I like fun things.
We do too.
Well, Shota Imanaga is John Tudor. That's a good one. He was quite good for sadly the Cardinals for a period of time. And I like Ben Brown. His number one comp is Steve Stone, Cy Young Award winner, former Cub.
And Chase Strump,
at the same time.
Chase Strump's first comp is Billy Martin, so he's going to be a fun manager.
Yes. Any of these comps stick out to you? I like, for example, the Eli Morgan comp of Gene Garber. I remember Gene Garber with the Braves, and he seemed like with his with that funny corkscrew windup he had. That's a fun one too. Hopefully he'll be as good as Gene Garber. Who else do we have here?
It's always just fun looking at the comps and just thinking of players that you haven't thought of in like 15 years, like Roger Salkeld of the Mariners who blew out his arm. I think it was his elbow. And Joan Baez, who I didn't think was a baseball player.
No, I just saw the movie. Absolutely not.
No, pitcher for the Nats. I totally forgot. I'm sure that it was like pronounced Yoan or something.
Yeah. Well, and of course, Keegan Thompson, number 3 comp is Pat Mahomes. Former Cub Pat Mahomes, probably not the Patrick Mahomes who's playing right now as we speak in the AFC Championship game. That was a good one. I remember Mahomes in his Cub years. Little did I know he would have a Super Bowl winning kid. Any of these stick out to you, Jeremy, of interesting? Like Javier Assad, his number 1 comp is Tim Wakefield. So obviously it's results oriented, not pitch selection oriented, because I don't think Assad has a knuckleball, although it'd be fun if he did.
Whenever I see Keegan, I think of Kenan Thompson from Saturday Night Live.
Sure.
And they know, and of course they look nothing alike, but that's still the image that comes in my head every time someone says the name Keegan Thompson. It's like, or I don't know which one is the Cub.
So Javier. So if you're Javier Assad, you've got 3 comps: Tim Wakefield, knuckleballer for the Red Sox for many years, Chichi Gonzalez, and then Anthony Young, losing his pitcher in history, right, with the Mets. It felt like, didn't he go like 2-19 or 2-20 1 year with them?
It was like 24 in a row or something over.
Yeah, it was awful.
It was guy. And the thing is he wasn't really that bad. The year he went 1-16, he actually had an above average ERA.
Yeah, that was the funny part.
It's one thing to lose that many games when you're terrible. It kind of stinks if you remembered for being terrible when you weren't terrible. I know. It's that you played for a terrible team that never scored for you. I always
Javier Assad could probably relate to that last year a little bit. He wasn't bad, but they did not score runs for him.
Always fun to go through and take a look at the fun comps. Make sure you go to Fangraphs to dig through the full list. And last question from me, Dan, before we let you go. Really appreciate it having you come on to talk Zips with us as our annual tradition always calls for it. Last question from me, little behind the scenes question for you. Is there anything like this year? Was there something new that you added to Zips, tweaked, or something that you might not think is exciting, but might be interested for the stat heads that are listening to this?
Well, you don't see it yet, but I'm doing another run right before the start of the season that takes into account spring training statistics. That's the first for me. It's Dan Rosenheck of The Economist some years ago did some research and found that spring training stats don't mean much, but they mean a little, and that applying them to projections improve the projections slightly. And I've kind of always had too many things on my plate to really go back to it, but I kind of got back to it last year. And so this year there will be slight changes as we get to the start of the season, as I incorporate very lightly spring training stats, which will most likely just push players towards one direction or another. You're not going to see a guy who's projected to hit 270 be projected to hit 300 after spring, but you'll see a little bit of a change. And I think I'm the only projection system maybe that is using spring training stats a little bit.
Do you think that it'll be the spring training stats will be more important based on the actual production in spring, or will be more of a playing time analysis to see who's actually going to get more opportunities than?
Playing time is helpful, but certain things do seem to have an effect. For instance, a pitcher who's suddenly striking out nobody or striking out a ton more than they used to, because those are performance numbers that change very rapidly in baseball. When you have a guy who changes his strikeout rate dramatically for a month, it usually sticks a lot more than like any other statistics. Like a guy who normally hits 250 hitting 310 for a month, that's probably nothing. It's probably batting average and balls in play, or a little luck, or something along those lines. But certain fundamental things that are kind of to the core of the player, like contact rate, strikeout rate, things like that, they're how hard they hit. Those types of things, when they change, are more likely to represent a real change that persists.
Oh, fascinating! Definitely looking forward to seeing that, and looking forward to the start of the season and the rerun of this. So definitely, thanks for coming on, Dan. Please remind our listeners where they can find all of your work on the internet.
Well, you can find me at fangraphs.com, D. Szymborski on Twitter, and on Blue Sky.
Excellent.
And you do have the Cubs winning the division, right? I guess
I have it really close. I'm not going to say anything definitive until I have the Cubs and the Brewers very close. Depending on assumptions, the Cubs tend to come out about a win ahead of the Brewers, but I don't want to, commit to that yet. But it would be unlikely, for instance, that at this point Zips would come out and say, "Oh, the Cubs are going to go 79-83." That's not likely. I think we're looking right now to projection. Again, a lot of assumptions, but nobody in the NL Central is doing anything to change the assumptions. Probably somewhere 87, 88, 89 wins is the most likely. But of course, there's a lot of uncertainty on the top and bottom, just like there is for any team.
Sure. And it's now that the Cubs have added a closer and some other things, perhaps that'll push them up to a win and a half better, or something to that effect.
Awesome. Dan, thanks again for coming on. Looking forward to talking to you again next season.
Thanks for having me, guys. Always fun.
Thanks, Dan.
Take care.
Always a great time catching up with Dan Szymborski, and the friends keep rolling here as we bring on longtime friend of the show. You know him from all his work at CHGO and other places on the internet. Jared Wyllys, thanks for coming on to talk Cubs with us tonight.
Good to be with you guys, and just to put the minds at ease of anybody watching on YouTube, I'm just in my basement at home. I've not been, captured and taken anywhere. Everything is okay.
Not only
my basement lair.
Not only can you watch the video version of this podcast on YouTube, but also if Spotify is your podcatcher of choice, you have the option to watch the video version of this podcast on Spotify as well. So YouTube and Spotify, and all of the audio platforms, of course. And Jared, we need you to come on and tell us about Cubs Convention, because neither Pat nor I could be in attendance this year. However, Marquee did air more of the Cubs Convention than they ever have before. And so we did get to see a lot of the panel stuff, but I know you were out and about and around at the Cubs Convention.
We certainly weren't going to miss the Ryan Dempster bingo, so we tuned in for that. But did we miss anything else?
Yeah, hoping you could catch us up on some of your personal highlights from being at the Cubs Convention.
Yeah, it was a lot different this year, just in that I felt like if you were just interested in the panels and the opening ceremony, you almost didn't need to be there, because you could sit from the comfort of your home and watch it all on Marquee. But I did, of course, had the opportunity to talk to Sammy Sosa, Derek Lee, because they were both Hall of Fame, or will be inducted into the Cubs Hall of Fame later this year. And of course, Sosa was like the big story of the weekend because this was his first time back with the team in 21 years. And so finally having him back there and his grand entrance on the stage on Friday night, I'm sure everybody has seen that. If you weren't watching it live, you've seen the clip since. So that was a lot of the excitement on Friday. And then Saturday I had more of the opportunity to talk to front office guys, players, and stuff like that. But yeah, Friday especially was all about Sammy.
People are really excited for Sammy's return. Like just from seeing it on play out on Marquee. But did you, in talking to people there, was there like a real buzz about people being really excited that Sosa's back?
Yeah, I mean there was a legit energy there that was very much about Sammy Sosa, because I've been there in years past when, I was there in 2017, for example, when it was just 2 months after they'd won the World Series, and there was a lot of energy that weekend, but in a different kind of way. This Cubs convention felt really exciting, but it was all about the one guy. And I think in talking to fans and the sentiment almost universally was just like, finally he's back. Finally we get to see him here with the team, being a part of things like this. It felt like it went on for too long. I think there's probably an argument to be made that he shouldn't have been kept away in the first place. But we at least got to this point where now he's back, and he himself was like downright jubilant the whole weekend. I saw him Friday and then again on Saturday for a while, and like the guy could not have been happier to be there. And I don't think he wasn't like putting on an act. He was acting that way, like back in the hallway behind the ballroom when he was just walking through. He was like high-fiving all of the reporters. He was the guy was just genuinely thrilled to be there, which was cool to see.
As somebody who, much like my contemporary Tom Ricketts, well, he's not really my contemporary, I guess he's older than me, but as someone who claims to have gone to a lot of Cubs games and sat in the bleachers when Sammy Sosa was there, and as I myself, having actually done all those things for real, like a lot, like 35 times a year back in those days, it's always not to me. Like I sort of, I grew up with the Cubs of the 80s, but the Cubs of the 90s, that 95 on, that's when I was in my 20s and sitting in the bleachers and going out with my friends. And that was the kind of the quintessential sort of stereotypical Cubs experience that people talk about, we never missed a Friday home game back in those days. And went to tons of games. And Sammy Sosa was such a delight to see play. I can remember, I think by 95, bleacher tickets were, I think, $14. And then the next year they were 15, and then they went up to 20, which seemed like a lot. And then they just, this is back before they really skyrocketed though, right? But then after his 98 season, things just kind of took off. And for anybody who wasn't around back then or wasn't really part of the scene, I got to tell you, the vibe and the whole Cubs experience, and the reason why the Ricketts can not spend a lot of money and just break even and still get 3 million people to come to the stadium every year it really started in that Sammy Sosa generation. And whatever people say, go back and look at attendance records from before then. That was really the time when Wrigley Field became the Wrigley Field that it is today. And we had the 07 and 08 seasons, obviously, later on. But in that that mid to late 90s and early 2000s and the 03 and 04 period, that was peak Cubs baseball pre, Theo Epstein. And so Sammy was not just a big role in it. It's hard to explain to people. He was the person, like not just, it's like he was one of, he was the guy, right? There were, explaining it to somebody today, and, I lived through the Michael Jordan Bulls era in the 90s. So it's hard to tell people who never lived through that either, what it meant to have him as the guy, but to be in Chicago at a time when he was and Jordan were at their peaks was really fascinating. And there were times when, I'd sit there at the game with my buddies or with my dad or somebody, and it'd be the 7th inning, like, well, the good news is Sosa should be up in the 8th. So we still have a chance. Like literally the fact that he had an at bat left in the game meant we could probably win this game if he can just get up there. It was that he was that crazy of a time period. And I just, it's been a long time since there's been anybody who you think that way of, right? It's like, well, maybe
Right.
they'll get a hit,
Right.
maybe they won't, but there's nobody in this last period of time that's been able to do that. I mean, this guy was averaging an RBI per game for 2 years in a row.
Yeah. I mean, similarly, I'm a little bit younger, but the 94 strike hit when I was 12. And so right at you're coming into just your hardcore sports fandom, you're 11, 12 years old. And so that was a hard thing to understand as a 12-year-old. And like a lot of people have said, it was that home run chase in 98 that kind of, I was always going to be a baseball fan no matter what. I was right back watching in 95, but watching Sosa McGuire in 98 when I was in high school, it was just that one of the most memorable summers I think I've ever had following, a baseball season. And because I grew up in Michigan, my first time going to Wrigley wasn't until 2004. I never set foot in Wrigley until that season. But I remember, even though it was, the tail end of his career, I remember walking in there and getting to my seat and being excited because I was going to get to see Sammy Sosa. And even then, this was after his peak seasons, but still it was it's Sosa. And watching him run out to right field from where I was sitting, I was like, I can't believe I'm seeing this in person. So it's a pretty special thing for sure.
98 was so cool that we actually twice took the Amtrak train to the world's most boring city, i.e. St. Louis, to watch the Sosa McGuire matchups, in that season.
Yeah.
And it was pretty electric.
Yeah, absolutely.
It was just a fun time. Now, having said all of that, can I just, before we move on, I just want to say, despite all of that, and as much as I appreciate Sosa and what it was like to have Sosa around then, I have to say, Derek Lee might be, he's one of my top 5 all-time favorite Cubs. He's up there with Dawson and Bill Buckner.
Yeah.
And he's the best. I love Derek Lee. The 7 or 8 years he was with the Cubs, they were some phenomenal seasons that he put up with the Cubs. And that was in a period. I remember being at the game 6 and 7 of the 2003 NLCS against the Marlins when, Lee was one of the guys who got one of the hits in the inning in the game 6 that crushed us. And then we got him in the offseason. And I'll never forget, I was listening to the score in the background one night. Peggy Kuzinski, I think, was doing a nighttime show there or something. And they announced that Derek Lee had been traded to the Cubs for Hee-Seop Choi and somebody else, I forget who, somebody non-consequential. And people were calling in saying, I can't believe they're giving up on Hee-Seop Choi. And it's I'm like, oh my God, this is great. This is exactly what they need. And then in 2004, he played well. And then he was part of those 2007, 2008 teams. It was a stretch with the Cubs when the Cubs are actually fairly, and it had been a long time. This is the first time really where you had a half a decade or more where the Cubs were in the playoffs 3 times and just missed it 2 other times. That was legitimate good Cubs teams. And he was so good. Derek Lee's the best, and such a good guy too. Gosh,
absolutely. I did feel a little bad for him during the convention because it did feel somewhat like he was getting overshadowed. So they announced the 2 of them as Hall of Fame inductees, but it was so much about Sammy. But I think if there's
I should have gone just to hang out with him. I would have lunch with him. I'd need someone to spend time with.
Right.
I would have definitely.
It makes me think that the Sammy stuff really came together late because
I think so.
if you're putting together your
brain, you never do the 2 at once, right?
Well, because you're thinking about the Cubs Hall of Fame, you're starting to lay out who you want to induct in the next few years, and if you knew Sammy Sosa was coming back, you probably would have done Aramis Ramirez with Derek Lee last year,
that
right?
That was a nice pairing.
Those 2 would have made more sense, and you would have got Derek Lee the flowers he deserves because you're right. Whoever you're putting with Sosa is going to get overshadowed by that, and Derek Lee deserves all the flowers. That guy was he was so good for so long and just a key part. I remember how excited I was because I watched what he did to us in 2003 and with the Marlins and it's oh wow he's coming to our team now. This is incredible, and he was, you just never thought about you never had to think about first base because it was just production on all sides. So it was just rock solid. You just never had to think about it. The front office panels and everything else. Did these go as you expected? Did you get any useful information out of this, or it was all the canned AI responses you expected?
Yeah, it's hard because I feel bad for the fans who go to those panels in particular, because some of those fans, they ask really good questions. They're not afraid to cut to the chase. And then they get this really, the kind of response that I'm used to hearing all the time, because that's just how they talk to us.
Yeah.
Where they're like, I'm going to say a lot of words that don't really mean much. Because I can't and won't come out and tell you the real thing unless it's off the record. Because we've had plenty of off the record conversations with Jed Hoyer where he's been really helpful and very informative. But as soon as the cameras and the microphones are on, that mode shifts. But I think it was pretty clear now in hindsight, knowing that it looks like they are trading for Ryan Pressly. They did say a lot that weekend about seeking bullpen help and looking for help for closer in particular. And his name was never mentioned specifically, but it was very obvious a week ago that they were like, this is something we are working on. And they were speaking pretty openly about that without getting specific, maybe about who. And so now, roughly a week later, it's no real surprise that, okay, they've made this trade, because it was clearly on their radar and something that they've been working on. So we did get that at least. Yeah.
In contrast to this convention, I have a lot of respect for the Theo Epstein season ticket holder events they used to have at, where was those? Chicago Theater or something?
Theater, yeah.
Yeah, went to a couple of those, especially early on in the rebuild. He was so blunt and really was not pulling punches when he said, this is what we're going to do. He's like, we're going to get worse. We're basically going to tank, is
right.
Not the word they would use, but we're tearing it down, and then we're going to rebuild.
Patience is what they were saying.
And we're going to do it through international free agency. We're going to do it through developing a farm system. We're going to trade some players who have some value now. We're going to get guys in who are veterans who we think are better than anticipated, and then probably flip them at the break. This is how we're going to build a championship roster. And he was very upfront about it and very honest about it. And it's a stark contrast to, for example, the 2021, we're just retooling and, we're going to get rid of these guys, but then we're going to just get, as opposed to, we're just going to kind of glide for about 5 years on the glory of our championship run. And we're going to bring in guys just good enough to kind of be a 500-ish team one way or the other, which is sort of what they've been, or actually worse at the beginning and now up to a little over 500. But we're not really going to make the kind of investment that we need to be a championship team, which is sort of where we ended up in this run. And like you say, just in terms of laying out a vision, I think one of the frustrations that fans have with the current regime, from the owner down to the GM, and maybe part of it's because the GM doesn't know what the president, Hoyer doesn't know what the owner's going to do year to year, but the lack of a vision moving forward has been very disconcerting to people, because, if you're looking at it in a kind of we can win the division every year, then you pick up a Freddie Freeman or you pick up a Gosman, you're all these free agents that have just kind of flown by. The Cubs never even considered, were never even in the running for. Instead, some of the curious moves they've made over the last 5 years that didn't seem to pay off, letting certain guys go and bringing in other people. And it just doesn't feel like even this offseason with the Kyle Tucker, who's a 1-year rental unless some magic happens. And then then you trade Bellinger right away. And even if they do get Pressly, I think people were expecting to get Pressly anyway, money wise, it feels like they're pulling the rug out from under us. That was the move. The Tucker move is a move you make before you go all in, right? Not to say, okay, well, that's all we're going to do. And so I think the combination of living through the Epstein era, where they were much more transparent and they did what they said they were going to do, moving into this era where things seem just much more murky, I guess would be a kind, generous word, a charitable word. And fans are kind of fed up because ticket prices are high, and the team just seems to be, they're not a bad team at all. We just had Dan Szymborski on talking about how Zips really likes the team this year, but they're not a bad team, but they're barely over 500, and you see other big market teams becoming really good, right? Really good. And we don't seem to be taking those steps. So I think it's a frustration level for people.
And to that, the last part of what you said, the Dodgers, it almost felt like it was a Dodgers convention, because the number of times that they were brought up, and with good reason, because you do look at all right, the Cubs are a little bit better than they were the last 2 years. Maybe instead of 83 wins, they're going to win 87 games.
Maybe they'll win the division in the smallest
right.
division in baseball, right?
When, maybe they can eke out a division title with 87, 88 wins, but we all know that the expectation is so much more than just that. I don't know that a lot of fans are going to be content with a division title the way that they might have been 12, 15 years ago. And especially when you look at it seems like the Dodgers have figured something out that they are taking full advantage of. And you look at the Cubs and with justifiably can say there's no real reason you can't be doing the same thing.
The talent gap is widening, I think, is the thing that bothers people, right? And it's for the reasons you point out: the deferred money, the willing to go all in, the Mets getting Soto, the Dodgers getting everybody else, the Phillies, being willing to spend money. You see these other big market teams being willing to pony up, and you see the Cubs kind of one step forward, two steps back.
And it's right, and it's not like you're not the Pittsburgh Pirates here. You're the Chicago Cubs, one of the largest markets in the country, with revenue stream upon revenue stream. And you're kind of looking around, and saying, I see the Dodgers doing this and the Mets doing this and the Phillies doing this. What on earth is
even the Giants to an extent, do
yeah.
that. And the Padres for sure.
And I don't think the answers coming from Carter Hawkins and Jed Hoyer, even when we spoke to them, just one-on-one away from the panel, I don't know that those answers are super satisfying, because I think it was Carter who said, he said financially it's harder to compete with those teams. And it sounds like a lot of their pitches to guys like Roki Sasaki is based on, hey, we're the Cubs, it's Wrigley Field, this historic franchise, our culture is really good. Chicago's an awesome city in the summer. We can pay you a lot of money.
Dogs.
Yeah, right. We can pay you a lot of money, not as much as the Dodgers are going to, but maybe you'll want to come here on a little bit of discount because Wrigley Field. And that's just, I think the answers that we're getting are players are no, that's not.
I'd rather get a championship.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Right.
I want to
win
coming anyway a couple times a year. So
right.
Exactly.
I want to win a championship and make more money. Why would I turn that down? So it's a problem.
I also think the conundrum that they face, and I don't know if you've had these conversations with Jed or Carter or even with the Ricketts, but one of the retorts that we hear is, no, we do spend a lot of money. And then the next question that rarely gets asked, because I think it's an impolite one, I think for the most part, is, well, you must not be good at it then, because you can't even win the Central Division. No offense, where nobody else is spending money, right? You can't have it both ways. Yeah. You can't say, well, we actually do spend a lot of money, half as much as some of these other teams, but still a lot of money. So don't criticize us, when it's but you're not winning with the money you are spending proportionately to other teams that are spending less than what you're spending. So something's got to give one way or the other.
Yeah, it's fair to wonder, are you spending that money well? So, and the results would probably indicate that maybe you're not.
And one way to paper over some of your mistakes, as the Dodgers and Yankees and Mets are apt to do, is to spend even more money. That way, when you make a bad signing here, there, you're not paralyzed for 7 years. It's we signed Jason Hayward and he's not as good as we thought he'd be. I guess we'll just sit it out for 4 years and wait till his contract expires, and then we'll start all over again, right?
Well, right. I think some of the Tom Ricketts comments coming out of that weekend also fanned the flames a little bit, as he said, quote, I think our fans somehow think we have all these dollars that the Dodgers have, or the Mets have, or the Yankees have.
I know, because I physically give them to you every game, every summer, lots of them.
And we just keep it. It's not true. We try to break even every year.
So Here's what I think, and I might be giving Tom Ricketts more credit than he deserves.
If you have to say that, you are.
Yeah. So I think it's possible that he's trying to communicate something other than how that sounded. Because I think you could look at what he said and see it as he's trying to say, like, we're bringing in this money, but we're not just sitting on it. When he says we're breaking even, it's like we take in the money, but then we turn around and spend it. I'm not
properties all over the neighborhood that aren't this.
Well, because that's the other part of this that he cleverly doesn't get into. But I think what he's trying to say is, like, I'm not just pocketing all of this money. We are doing something with it. But then, yes, the second part of that, and that's what I wish he had spoken to more, was what are you doing with it? Because we all see, we're not dumb. We see what the Cubs payroll is. And yes, it's higher than a lot of teams around baseball, but it's still not nearly as high as some of these teams we've just talked about.
And the revenue the Cubs bring in is higher than all but like 3 teams in baseball, right?
Exactly. And so we see that, and it's like, well, okay, so if you're breaking even, you're spending it somewhere, and what is that? And that's where you kind of have to look around and say, okay, well, you own most of the neighborhood now. You've built up all of these other, real estate projects. Like, that starts to feel like, okay, you're breaking even, but not because you are investing in the product on the field.
We were told that all of that concert money, all of the events like the Winter Classic, all of these things were going to go back into
Winter Wonderland.
Yeah, they were all going to go back into the team. Yep.
The wheelbarrows of cash, right?
Yeah,
exactly. That's where
that
was
the other one.
Yeah, that's where people have, when they hear that, they also remember all of the ways that this was going to go back in. And so when you tell us you don't have the other revenue streams, you've already told us about how you were going to get all the other revenue streams. So is Crane Kenny not doing his job, or is there a disconnect somewhere else?
Yeah, something's not working at some level. And I think if you were really invested in making sure you had a winning baseball team and for the long term, then you'd be investigating that somehow. Because if it's not you, there's someone somewhere in your organization that's not doing their job right, and you need to figure that out. And yeah, maybe
that's
it's
what fans
Kenny,
want. They want accountability, right? The fans want accountability. Somebody somewhere can't be doing well enough at their jobs if you're the 4th highest or 3rd highest revenue team in baseball and you're spending around the 10th most, and your product on the field is not yielding any playoff appearances, right? That's a bad reality, but it's true.
Especially when we were taught, we learned from Theo Epstein telling us during those season ticket holder meetings you described earlier, Pat. He told us never waste an off season, never waste a postseason. Like, every opportunity you get a crack at the postseason, you have to go for it, because it could be you need to be a consistent playoff team and make a run every time, because that's how you win a championship. It's you need to be consistent and consistently making the playoffs and never waste an opportunity. And
that was before they let in all these extra teams. Now it's like, just out of self-respect, you should make the playoffs, for God's sake,
It's getting to be like the NBA.
Yeah, right. Now, Jeremy, I want you to talk to Jared, because you promised me you would. Remember we were having that conversation one Saturday afternoon or Sunday afternoon? I was walking down the street and you were driving around, and we were talking about marquee and about television networks and about television revenue and media revenue, and how the Cubs obviously are saying, I assume they're right, they won't open their books, so we don't know, but Marquee Network hasn't brought in the money they want it to. But we also see all these other teams whose TV contracts have completely fallen apart altogether, right? And we're not in that position. What's the lay of the land here, and what should we make of any of this stuff?
Yeah, that's that's where they'll point to the Dodgers have so much cash because they made their television deal at the right time, and now the market has collapsed, and the Cubs have their own network. It has distribution, and they are in significantly better shape than the teams that don't.
Which is most teams, right? All those
Most
Diamond Vision teams, like the Padres.
Yes,
and
that were part of the Bally's with the Diamond bankruptcy. MLB had to step in and air games. You have teams like the Diamondbacks who are going back to over-the-air broadcast because there's no TV deals. The Cubs are still in significantly better shape than the majority
better
of
than
these
the Pirates
teams.
and the Reds and the Brewers, right?
Yeah. So
even with maybe having not started at the optimal time the way that the Dodgers network did,
which the Cubs could have. Craig Kenny had bought out the deal they had, by the way, with whatever the sports network was that they were on back then, but they chose not to.
Yeah, and in spite of the timing, Marquee is still doing pretty well. There's no sign of issue with that network. So maybe it's not quite as successful as the Dodgers network, but it's still pretty darn successful. So again, to me, it just goes back to so many of the other things that the Ricketts family has chosen to invest in. Those things seem to be working, except for the team. And you got it right with some of those early years, the first 5, 6, 7 years of your ownership, but then since then it's been this very different trajectory. And that's what I think a lot of the fans have trouble with understanding is, why this shift that we're seeing, where we went from transparency from the front office, a lot of success. Yeah, the competitive window closed pretty quickly, but we kind of feel like that's because you stopped investing in supporting the players on the field.
Bryce Harper,
Exactly. Like you missed some opportunities to keep that competitive window open, and just chose to start sitting out on some of these kinds of players as they became available. And then now here we are.
Back when the Cubs were the hot ticket where people actually wanted to come here, as opposed to now where they want to go to the Dodgers. And the Dodgers are like, we'll take you.
Yeah, and that's all changed. And so I think that's part of the part of the frustration too is, okay, I see that you're having success with these other things. But the thing if I'm a fan, I care about the most is the team I go to watch on the field, and they're a 500 baseball team at best, maybe slightly better. And that's not good enough anymore.
Seeing the Cubs sitting on the cash that they had after moving Cody Bellinger, you were waiting for that next move to come, and watching Tanner Scott sign with the Dodgers, it was only a matter of time before the Cubs had to do something, as they were missing out on players left and right. And so today, as of the time of this recording, Ryan Pressly, like we mentioned earlier in the show, has been traded for. He is coming to the Cubs. His $14 million salary, he waived his no-trade clause to come here to the Cubs. Going the other way, 20-year-old righty Juan Bello is going back in return. So he was in Low A Myrtle Beach. And Pressly will have his no-trade clause reinstated once this deal is finalized. So he'll be here in Chicago, $14 million salary and a no-trade clause. But huge help for the back end of this bullpen, which people have been screaming for.
Yeah, because that was also a popular subject at Cubs convention, was the lack of a closer, or the lack of somebody who you really felt like could step into that role. They've got some internal options that are intriguing, but it was an obvious area of need, especially given how the 2024 season went. There was one fan during one of the panels who brought up, the 26 blown saves, and so that, that frustration is real. And Craig Counsell talked about it.
They were pretty awful, by the way. Last year was a really rough year. Like the highs and the lows were crazy. Yeah. Throughout the course of every week, it was one game this way, one game the other, and the blown saves were brutal. I get why those guys are frustrated.
Yeah, and I always think, I know I say it a lot, but frustrated with good reason. It's justified in my opinion. So I think this move for Pressly will help that. There are some questions in kind of looking at his performance from 2023 to 2024. Looking at the fact that the Astros didn't use him as a closer a whole lot last year. There's a little bit of a dip in his velocity and his fastball. He's 36. So there's some questions about like what kind of a performance you're going to be able to get from him this year. But the Cubs obviously see something there where they think they can get enough that he's going to help to shore up this closer's role. Because I still think that there are some guys in the system that could get you some saves if need be. I'm really intrigued by like Porter Hodge, for instance. He had 6 saves in the month of September alone. There might be something there, but I don't want to hand the closer role to a guy who, is just coming off of half a rookie season. So
you can say the same thing about Ben Brown. And
yeah,
his injury.
he's another name that came up, and coming off the injury, and you don't really know how he's going to look, those kinds of things. So I think it's a smart move. You get a veteran who's closed a lot of games. He has 112 career saves. Like he's done this enough that I think he's going to slot into that role pretty nicely. And I saw today that they're still kind of doing their due diligence on a couple of other options like David Robertson and Ryan Stanek. So they're just because they've traded for Presley doesn't mean that now they're saying, okay, we're set. There's still some more moves coming, I think.
Awesome. Jared, thanks a lot for coming on and talking to us. And please remind all of our listeners where they can find your work on the internet.
Yeah, I'm at CHGO Sports, so you can find my written work at allchgo.com. And then I also have a Substack that I write called The Dugout. You can find that. I usually will link to new posts on my social media. I'm just at Jay Wyllys. I'm on Twitter/X, and I've gotten into the Blue Sky in the last few months, or even over on Instagram and places like that. But most of all, I would love it when people read my written work on CHGO and on Substack.
One last request from you, Jared, before you go. One of the things we're going to do this year is a new feature where we're going to profile a Cub from the past, former Cub of, from the last 100 years. There's plenty to choose from. And we're going to ask each of our guests to nominate someone for the next episode. So,
oh, man.
You're the first one to do, or you're the first one. It's a new year here, so I'm kind of throwing this out at you. I feel bad.
You can throw out a Cubs player. We do the research, and next week we come back and talk about a profile piece for that player.
I love that question. I'm sure this guy has already come up, but one of the guys that, I don't know, just speaking of like the last 20 or so years of baseball that I loved Moises Alou.
Yes.
I know he's a big part of that, that the famous Bartman play, whatever. But I just really liked him as a player during his time with the Cubs. So I'll say Moises Alou.
Great pick.
Great family history, rich family history. Not as great on the base paths, but boy, that guy could hit.
Man, could he?
Yeah.
His 2004 season is highly underrated in Cubs lore, I'll tell you that.
Awesome. Jared, thanks again, and we look forward to talking to you many times during the season.
You. Sounds good.
Thanks.
See you guys.
Jam-packed show today, Pat. We got a lot done. This is what happens when we don't podcast for a month.
I know.
Got a lot to cover.
We did a double.
Like
one of those artists that are too lazy to put out an album, and then when they do, they have more songs they know what to do with. So here's your 20 songs.
Yes, good. And usually what happens is we put out this, and then the Presley news would have broke tomorrow, and then we
talked so long it had to break while we're doing it.
So no, we will be back next month as we pitchers and catchers will be reporting in February.
It'll be less than a month, so
you got to make sure, sure that you stay subscribed. Pat mentioned here at the end with Jared that every single week our guests are going to nominate a player. We will do a player profile that will be our history piece for the 2025 podcasting season. We'll be recapping and breaking down a player from Cubs history that is chosen by our guest every week. If we don't have a guest that week, sometimes we do a host-only show. And when schedules require us to do host-only, that's when we will turn to our patrons over at patreon.com/Wrigleyville Nation. We will turn to our patrons to nominate a player for us to break down next week. So
my dad's already making a list of 1950s Cubs. Trust me.
Looking forward to all of the great picks. Moises Alou, a great way to lead off this season and talk about him. So looking forward to that. And And I'm looking forward to all of the guests we'll have throughout the course of the 2025 season. So make sure you stay subscribed to the podcast. We talked about the video versions available at YouTube and Spotify. Same thing for the audio is also at Spotify, but at any podcatcher of your choosing. Make sure you stay subscribed until through spring training, because you don't know when you're going to have a new episode pop up in your feed. So you want to make sure that you are staying subscribed to the podcast. And then once the season starts, every single week we'll be here breaking down the Chicago Cubs. Pat, any last thoughts before we close the show?
Looking forward to pitchers and catchers. Let's get a couple more pitchers.
Yes, please. And with that, we're going to call it a podcast. We're going to wrap it up. Make sure you're following us on all of the social media platforms as well. That's Twitter, X, Blue Sky, Threads, Instagram, all of the places we can be found at Wrigleyville Nat. That's the best place to find us to interact with the show. We love to hear your thoughts on the Cubs. You can also find all the links I described, the entire back catalog of this podcast. Everything is available for you. Even the store, if you want to get some merchandise, all of that is available for you over at WrigleyvilleNation.com. With that, we're going to wrap it up and call it a podcast. Pat, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thanks again, everyone, for listening. We'll talk to you again next time.